decided I'd start out by reading, because I'm probably not going to be able to afterwards. My man is black, golden, amber, changing, warm mouths of brandy, fiend. So opens Maya Angelou's poem to a man. If I'd read those lines back in the 1970s, this story would never have happened. Instead, ignorant, trusting, believing in love, and woefully too young, I raced in. I've been rereading Angelou's poetry recently because her passing has brought memories of my youth vividly back, like Léon Damas's long held-in hiccup, and I relive them again and again. I've been known to say that I'm the Zelig of the second half of the 20th century because it has been my great good fortune to turn up in multiple special spots. I lived and studied in Paris when Les Halles was still going strong and the buildings were gray. I've supped with Sembène in Senghor, Senegal, and I've danced in the Candomblé ring in Jorge Amado's Bahia. However, the real reason that I identify with the Woody Allen character is that it was my privilege to spend a part of my youth with Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, and their circles of friends as they were becoming icons of 20th century America. Their joy in one another, the fierceness of their intellectual pursuits, and their absolute dedication to civil rights and the righting of civil wrongs of all sorts made their names hallmarks of honesty and totems for truth that influenced the world. I'm not central to the story, although I have lived it. Rather, it is about an extraordinary circle of friends who came together, lived outrageously, loved abundantly, laughed uproariously, and savored life while they created work that would come to define the era. That they knew one another was interesting. That they partied together, savored one another's company, encouraged one another's endeavors, celebrated one another's achievements, and mourned one another's losses is extraordinary. This tale is also the story of a city, New York City. Its neighborhoods, its vibrant life is also a character, for no other place in the world could have spawned and celebrated their lives with such intensity. Paris had the Belle Époque and the existentialist 1950s. London had the swinging 60s. And New York City in the early 1970s was a hub of the universe city. It was the city in the throes of a major transition when restaurants could offer a glimpse of the fading world of cafe society or bubble with the excitement of the new era that was being created. And the clubs that existed for every possible social stripe throbbed nightly with the excesses of sexual and moral revolution that had been ushered in the 1960s. Life was lived in widescreen technicolor in ways that had never before existed. It was the city before AIDS and economic downturns made it a very different place. Memory has muted some of the vibrancy of the colors and the dates fade into a continuum, but the vitality of the friendships, the commitment to activism, and the joie de vivre of those heady days remain as palpable as the intertwined connective tissue of the lives that were lived then. James Baldwin was at the center of this circle of friends. His huge presence radiated warmth and intensity. His cultural and political stature at this point in time was enormous. Through my young eyes, being in Baldwin's circle, however tangentially, felt at times as though we were all in attendance at the court of a very reluctant Sun King. Although the group was egalitarian, there was an unspoken hierarchy, and everybody sort of knew where they fit in. If Baldwin was the pivot of the literary court, his trusted second was a gentleman and a gentleman from Durham, North Carolina, named Samuel Clemens Floyd III, Angelou's Amber Sam. Floyd's name's literary allusion to Mark Twain was prescient, for Sam had been one of the early black writers on staff at Newsweek and was the director of faculty and curriculum and taught English in the Higher Education Opportunity Program, SEEK, at Queens College, where I also worked. Like Candomblé Orisha Ogun, breaker of bonds who clears paths and builds roads, it was Sam who opened the way into the circle of friends for me and led me down the rabbit hole into the wonderland that was that moment in time.
So that's Jessica Harris.
In the flesh.
In the flesh. Many of you know her, so I feel a little bit silly having any words to say to introduce her, but even by way of just my own life and my own experience. But it's an honor, truly, to be here with you, Jessica. Thank you. And I do want to start by telling a little story about the first time we met.
Okay.
Which you probably remember more clearly than I do, not because I was important, but because your memory is better than mine. But many years ago, like 15 years ago, I was in culinary school, and I was learning about French techniques and thinking like, oh, this was the basis on which you would learn about all cuisine in the world. And one of my instructors kind of subtly suggested, he's like, okay, well, and he was one of the instructors, so he had that sort of indoctrination also. But he kind of subtly suggested, well, what do you know about African cooking and how it's influenced what we eat? And the answer was nothing. And he suggested that I should know someone named Jessica Harris. And I should maybe look into what she's done in her work. And years later, I somehow found myself at a dinner and an event where I was seated next to Jessica Harris. And I thought, oh my God, there she is. There she is. And I have no idea what to say to her, so I'm just not going to talk to her. And I would sit there and just be like, oh my God, oh my God. And I ended up talking to the gentleman on this side.
Who was Bob Nyman from Nyman Ranch, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't it?
No, it was Rob Walsh.
It was, okay.
But
almost
but
the
this
same.
sort of is suggesting that this table, this was a table of really notable people in the food world and food writers, and I was a very novice writer who had somehow found my way. Like I was total like
he was writing for Gourmet
open.
magazine. Let's not get too.
Well,
crazy.
I mean, but I was like, but I was like just starting, and like someone had left the door open. I kind of snuck my way in. And there was a seat at the table, so I sat there, and the gentleman on the other side was asking me, "So you're like the new hotshot. What do you do?" And I had no idea how to answer him because, when I'm among civilians, I just say, "Oh, I write about food," and that's a fine answer for most people. This is 2002 or 3, and so people were like, "Oh, that's kind of cool and weird," and like that was kind of enough to satisfy most people. But here I am at a table with Jessica Harris, and you can't just say, "Oh, I write about food," right? Like, so I was like, I had no idea what to say. We continue. The dinner goes on, so on and so forth. An hour, 2 hours later, dessert's over, whiskey's on the table, and Jessica turns to me and says, "Before, when Rob asked you that question about what do you do and you didn't have an answer, you need to have an answer." And not only was I like, oh shit, I just got totally called out, but I remember being so distinctly astounded because not only did this woman have expressive enough an interest and generosity to actually address me and to say something that would be useful to me, but also like, how did you even know I was having that conversation over here?
I'm going to tell you something that Sam would have said, and Sam was a wellspring of peculiar Southernisms, but he had some of them that were a little more scatological and profane, and this is one of them. He would say, "Jessica, you can hear a rat pissing on cotton at 20 paces. Yeah. So that's how I overheard the conversation.
And I believe it, because there was a nobody sitting next to you having a conversation about how he knew nothing, and all of a sudden you remember that. And so you turned to me, and this is the thing I will truly never forget. You said to me, "That's the other thing. You have to always be listening." And not only was that probably the best advice I've ever received, but it's something that rang in my head so much as I was reading this book.
How much I was listening?
Because it is about you at an earlier time of your life in this group of luminaries, Baldwin, Maya Angelou, so on and so forth, feeling, as I got in the sense of the book, that because you were much younger, because you were brought into the group by way of your relationship with Sam, that it was, and even in the passage you just read, that this was a group that, in whose lives you were not central, but in whose lives you're deeply connected. And so much of this book was about a time in your life where you weren't giving advice so much as probably
taking it.
Yeah. And so much of it is about that act of listening and learning.
The original title of the book was A Moment in Time, not necessarily My Soul Looks Back. And so the idea was to talk about that moment, that particular point in time when this world existed in a way that it hadn't existed before and hasn't existed since.
And so when you were reflecting on, it's a moment in time, but the story spans years and years.
Virtual decade, and then the end of the book goes on beyond that up to the present.
So when you were thinking about this book and you were thinking about this project of now crystallizing these memories, what was the first memory you wrote down?
I think it's actually the passage I just read. I think it's that. It all seems to be a blur. I remember that there were 15 drafts. That's not a blur. Because I've got a hash mark somewhere on my back for each one of those. But I think it was that passage, because I think that passage was actually, in probably a slightly different form, part of the proposal. And the proposal came after I did an article, Kim Severson from the Times, I don't know, some point in conversation that we'd had somewhere, knew that I had known Maya Angelou. And when Angelou died in 2014, I guess, Kim called me and said, I just want to ask, did you ever cook with her? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, yeah, I did on several occasions. She said, would you be interested in writing something? So I did, and it actually came out in the Times. And then I was sitting with my editor, who is hiding somewhere. I've got a couple of editors in the house, and that ever makes you nervous. You have no idea. But we were talking about all kinds of other projects, and somehow or other I think, lobbed over the net. Oh, by the way, did you read that article? And she sort of looked and she said, that probably should be your next project. And that's how it all started. Now, that's my memory of it. She may have a different one, but we're not going to ask her tonight.
So the image you had, the first image you had was of cooking with Maya Angelou.
Well, that was the catalyst, if you will. I think the image of the time was really that rabbit hole. Last week, I did a tour that is online at newyorkmagazine.com today, and it was going back to the village. And one of the things that I did, just as I was getting the book started, I think they had put, do you remember when that was, Helen? They had put a plaque up on 81 Horatio Street about a year and a half ago. Please let me introduce Helen Brody Baldwin, who was James Baldwin's sister-in-law. And we were there, but I could look up at that house, and I could, to this day, tell you exactly where the furniture was, what hung on the wall, where the pictures were. And it's fascinating because the house has been totally redone. The house has been...
This is Club 81.
Club 81.
Tell us about what happened at Club 81.
Everything. I know better than to tell y'all everything that happened at Club 81. I have not had my usual quantity of red wine, and even after that, I wouldn't tell you. But yeah, no, Club 81, yeah, no. Some things need to draw the veil of discretion. But no, Club 81 was where Sam lived, and Sam had met Baldwin because Baldwin had lived at 81 Horatio Street as well. And so they had met as neighbors at some point. I don't remember the exact time period. I think Baldwin had lived there from 53 to 61. I got it written down somewhere, but certainly through 61. And Sam's apartment was on what my father would have called the parlor floor. The parlor floor being the one that's usually the grander of the floors as you go in, and it was probably the original entry floor. It's been transformed into that again, but back in the day, you used to enter downstairs, below street level, and then come up inside the house. So that when I went back to look at the house to try to recall memory, it was completely changed because it's gone back to being a single-family private house. You want to hear irony? Owned by the Hearst family, I understand. And they've redone the, I guess, original stairway so that the stairway now leads into what would have been Sam's bedroom. That would be their entry hall. But if you blindfolded me and took me into that apartment, I could negotiate it because it was just that vivid and it was just that much of a nucleus for people. The kitchen was there, the living room was there, there was a table on the wall. Next to the table was a ladder-back rush seat chair in which Sam would sit by the window and rule the world. You know, he had a Siamese cat, a blue point, named Blues, and he never left the house without saying to Blues, "Take it easy, Greasy, you got a long way to slide." And Blues would sort of go, meow, and that would be their farewell, you know, for the day. But it was so vivid. I have a peculiar memory where I recall things like that full.
And so the story, much of the early story takes place in that apartment where these friends gathered, where it was a sort of salon of the time. But you also travel. And certainly in your own career, you traveled a lot. But in the context of this story, you traveled with Sam. And there's a moment that I remember reading and finding so vivid and so intense. And I would just love to hear you talk about it in your voice. Mm-hmm. And it's the moment in the book where you're with Baldwin in France. And you're staying, I believe, in his home.
Mm-hmm, in Saint-Paul-de-Vence.
And where he's working at night in a little apartment.
The torture chamber.
Which you refer to as the torture chamber.
You referred to.
Tell us about that moment and tell us about what happened there.
Well, the apartment, or the house in Saint-Paul-de-Vence was multi-leveled. And Baldwin lived and wrote on the ground, it was also on a hill, so the ground floor was not the ground floor. You could enter on one level, but you could also go down a level and still be not underground, but just have a different optique. And it kind of had its own entrance, and you had to go out to go down. Or that's my recollection. And, we heard typewriters because it was pre-computer, so there was typewriting. And one evening we were all sort of assembled, and it was Sam, it was me, it was Baldwin, it was Bernard Hassel, and I don't remember if it was anyone else. It may have just been the four of us. But he had made popcorn, and we went downstairs and had a big old bowl of popcorn, and he read from after dinner until after dawn the entire book of If Beale Street Could Talk. So it was just, I'm 26, 27, 28. It was an extraordinary moment. It was just those are the things that mark you. And he read it particularly looking straight at me. And then asked, well, did you like it? Yeah. And then a few days later, and this is what those times were. It sounds also so grandiose, but if you were in certain places in those times, and some of you in the room were in those places in those times, so you know exactly what I mean. These are just the people you were with. It wasn't that you were looking for or trying to be or thinking about. I worked at Essence. I was book review editor at Essence. I started out as book review editor, then ultimately became travel editor, did some feature writing. Well, one of the features that I did at Essence early on was, I think, 1974 or 75, and it was one of the earliest interviews of Toni Morrison. And the title was I Will Always Be a Writer, because she had just published Sula. And so I remember going into her office at Random House, because that was where she worked, and she sort of hid on the masthead because Toni is her nickname. Her real name is Chloe, so she was listed as Chloe. And used to go upstairs and, get books, because I am not even a bibliophile. There is a mania that I am very much aware of, that is, if there's a book and there's me and there's room to take it home, I'm taking it home. So
this room looks a little bit like
yeah,
room,
yeah.
actually.
This is like, it's very familiar. Mine aren't rare. Mine are just books. But with that in mind, I had known her from the book runs that I used to do, but equally from that article. And I'm not sure what the time frame is, but a couple of days after the first reading, she came to visit. And the whole process began again. The popcorn, the going downstairs, and the reading. And this time, looking at her. But she, who was certainly Baldwin's equal and certainly Baldwin's contemporary friend, I don't want to say running buddy, but friend, and friend in profound ways of shared talent, shared heart, shared soul, understood exactly why If Beale Street Could Talk is written from the point of view of a young woman. And what I finally intuited was, it was about confirmation. Did I get it right? Is the voice correct? Does that work? And she got that instantly and could respond. So those were those moments. And they're both in the book. I mean, I got 4 stories. You're going to hear the same ones tonight and read them again, you know.
But I wanted to ask you about it, because I just love to hear you tell stories. And it's a real pleasure to read something and then have you actually have to tell the story.
In the same words, probably.
But also because, as you just alluded to, and I think you're a little more critical of yourself in the writing, it seemed like you felt in that moment that you understood, but that you also understood that you didn't live up to the challenge
No,
he
I
was
hadn't.
giving you.
I hadn't, because actually the young lady that is the protagonist of the book was my age. And so it was really a question to me that I couldn't answer or didn't know how to answer.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I felt lacking. I mean, I felt doubly lacking when Morrison knew exactly and could respond. But, I was me, and that was way back then. Right. And I don't know that I would be able to respond to that now, because, the thing that happens is, and from my vast pinnacle of age, let's not go there, and if I ever find Tejal Rao, I'm going to beat her by the head and shoulders with chains because she put it in that article. I think it's Times format. But the point is, if you're 20 years younger than someone, you always remain 20 years younger than they are. No matter how old you get, they're still your elders. And so, I mean, I think that respect, I think that distance, I think that awe would maintain if they walked into the room today. Right. Absolutely. You know, I'm still the kid.
Yeah.
It's nice to be able to be the kid.
I have to admit to you that it was so one of the reasons. Like, you know, I think of you as the queen, right?
Not empress.
Yeah. and I say that, you know, jokingly kind of, but I also feel strongly that, you know, you are someone who I think a lot of people of my generation in particular in this field understand the import of, the trails that you've blazed, the topic that you've covered, what you've taught us, and we hold you in a certain light, and we hold you on that pedestal, which is an unfair place to put anyone.
Thank you.
I'm glad you like it. It's very well shined. But so it's fascinating to read this book on a lot of levels, and one of them is to see someone who, you know, my first interaction was you turned to me, you smacked me upside the head, essentially, corrected me, and dropped knowledge on me that I carried with me to this day. And I'm like, that was my 5 minutes with Jessica Harris. That's incredible. Who touches you in that way? Who touches your life in that way?
Well, now you know where I learned it.
But to read you write about your own youth with such a vulnerability and such a, I don't want to say to recognize that vulnerability and to recognize the inexperience in yourself, but not just in a way where like you were laughing about, but in a way where you sort of where you were acknowledging this hierarchy in your life and in the circle of people who you were close with. I wonder, now writing this book this many years later, looking back on those relationships, I know you just said they will always be your senior and you will always be the junior, but did the process of writing this book change in some way the way you think now about the relationships as you thought of them then? Does that make sense?
I think so. I'm not sure. Let me lob this at you and see if this is what you're talking about. A couple of things. I think I am not in my head or in my heart that which people think I am. People, you know, that pedestal, the queen thing, I joke about it, but that's not, you know, I walk into the room and I'm still that kid. I'm still that, you know, insecure young lady. That's me. That's where it is. Here come the tears, and that always tells me something's right. The thing is that the way people have taken what they've read in here makes me wonder what they see that I don't necessarily know. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting thing.
Sure.
You know, because I don't know that. I'd probably be a bitch on wheels if I did. I just don't know it.
It's that thing with writing, right?
Yeah.
Where you put whatever you want to put on the page, but you have to leave it to the reader and trust the reader in some way to make meaning of it. It takes two people to make something, to make meaning out of the words.
Well, it takes somebody to read and somebody to write. Well, somebody to write and somebody to read.
But writing this, you've written 10 books before this?
No, 12.
12 books before this.
Well, actually, you really want to get it? I've written 12 books. I've edited or, you know, organized 3 others, so it's 15, or translated.
Yeah. This book is both freer to me as a reader in the language, in the imagination, and by that obviously I don't mean you're making things up, but in the sense of like where the mind is going and the connections the mind is making, to me anyway as a reader, than anything else I've read of yours. Although those books have been histories and they've been cookbooks and they've been histories in the form of cookbooks. So it's a very different kind of work.
Well, yeah, this is almost a leap of faith. I mean, it certainly was a leap of faith on the part of my editor. You know, I think you can write memoir. Like, it's not 1 cup or 2 cup. You know, add a teaspoon, stir. It's a very different thing. And I mean, it's narrative. It's not recipe. I know that with the cookbooks, the head notes got progressively longer and longer and longer until ultimately they turned into High on the Hog, right, which was narrative. But to talk about yourself is it's a scary thing. I think there was a part of me that needed to get it out. Mm-hmm. But I think equally there's a part of me, I know that there is a part of me that is absolutely terrified now that it's out. Mm. Because among other things, it has given people license to ask all sorts of questions that they don't ask about a cookbook.
Sure.
You know, it's like, okay, well, somebody was, well, how did you feel about your father? It's like, huh? You know, none of your business. You know, but having written a memoir in which my father and mother figure, people ask questions, people say things, people, you know. The line that seems to particularly intrigue people, and I'm going to say it first so that we can get that out of the way, is the first words that Nina Simone ever said to me. She said across a very crowded room, and they were, "Who's the bitch in the red dress?" And that's pretty much it. But it didn't define anything other than that's what she said. And we now know so much about the problems, the difficulties, the madness, figuratively and literally, that she was dealing with, that it makes sense, or at least it can be explained. Mm-hmm. But back then, I had no idea, but it is one of those questions that pretty much invariably, anybody who reads the book, that's on their list of 10 questions. How did you feel about that? It's like, how would you feel? A little kind of knocked out of the ballpark. Already was there by sufferance, if you will, because I was in the room because of Sam, not because I belonged. Mm-hmm. And there you were. And you deal with it and you move forward and you try to figure out a way to get around that one and not let it be the rock of your soul.
That was such an incredible line in the book that I didn't want to ask you about it, because I wanted people to come to it on the page and be like, God damn. But that sense of belonging.
Or not.
Or not. To this day, maybe I'm just sort of retreading a question asked before, but maybe I'll come at it from a different angle. To this day, now that you've written this book, and now you know it's in the world, and now you know there will be questions asked, and there are going to be people asking you about these relationships and so on and so forth. Did that sense of belonging come to you? Did it come to you later?
It may be coming to me now. Because I think what people have said in the way they look at the book is, and maybe, you know, because I'm damn near 70, I can look back and say, maybe that was me being tangential, but being at least accepted in the tangent, because, you know, I was a kid and could have been kicked to the curb. because they saw something.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what, but who knows? You know, the person with whom I had the longest time was Maya Angelou, and she actually got to see the cookbooks.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we had a couple of, well, certainly one that probably lives somewhere out in the cybersphere that was an amazing 1-hour conversation that we had, just sort of like two old chums over the back fence, yada, 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 back and forth for an hour on her radio program when she was doing program for Sirius Radio. And that was an interesting thing. That was an interesting thing because then we began to come to it as, if not equals, because that wasn't the case, but we at least came to it from a different place of respect.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly mine had always been there, and I mean, I think hers had always been there for me, but with the cookbooks, with the, hey, you've got expertise in this, and I want to give you that. And that's a different place. I mean, I have a house in New Orleans. She would never come to New Orleans without calling me if I were there. And she was extraordinarily generous. I would drag my friends to meet her, and she'd have us to dinner and, you know, show us her bus, because she had a bus that Oprah had given her that was just amazing, you know, that was like a tour bus for rock bands. And, you know, it had a bathtub and 2 beds, because she had 2 drivers so they could spell each other, so it never had to stop. And, you know, I was teaching at Dillard, I think, one time that she came through, and so I said, may I bring somebody? She said, yeah, I brought the dean from Dillard, who was like, whoa, okay, you know. I have a little adopted, I call myself her Auntie Mame, and I've been her Auntie Mame since she was 8. She's now almost 30, or maybe 30-something, I'm not sure. You get lost when you don't have kids. It's all somewhere in the netherworld. But she is a great baker, so she used to always bake cheese straws. And Maya, and I'll explain why I am calling her Maya in a minute, as opposed to Dr. Angelou, would always ask for the cheese straws. I would bring them to her on New Year's Day sometimes, and she would sit around that table. And I remember one year somebody was going back for seconds and thirds and fourth, and she just delicately moved them to the other side and kept right on talking, you know. But that young lady had the opportunity of meeting her backstage at a conference, and there were several others. I mean, people have reminded me of things I didn't even remember that I had done. Like, I have a girlfriend who said, "No, remember that dinner you took us to?" It's like, oh yeah, okay, I do, you know. So it's stuff like that. But she was always, you know, always there, and she actually always picked up the phone. If she couldn't get to the phone, she would always call me back until literally the day she died. So that was interesting. And now about the Maya as opposed to the Dr. Angelou. Third form of address, indirect address, is very important in African American world sometimes. Not always, but often. And particularly in academic situations. We have had to work so long, you know, twice as long, twice as hard, be 5 times smarter, fill in the blank, just to get there. And so the acknowledgement of the there once one is there is important. Hence, Dr. Angelou. Hence, her driver she referred to as Mr. Standback. Okay, everyone had the appropriate honorific. Now, I had known her for better than 40 years. So in indirect address, I would always refer to her as Dr. Angelou. But to her face, I could say Maya, and it was okay simply because she knew that I had entered her life when she was Maya. And I think that was almost a favor that she accorded me, because I'm not sure she gave it to everybody.
It was a favor she accorded you, but I think it was also a place that you had earned.
Well, we'll know that eventually when we talk again.
Shall we open the floor?
Oh God, no! These people know me too well. Don't ever open the floor.
Should we just shut off
Not
the
to
mics and
those
walk
people.
away?
No, all right, go ahead, open the floor. Yeah.
Does anyone have a question?
Oh, how did I know it would be you? Yes, Martha.
I just want to know about the picture on the cover, because I've known you for 50 years, and I haven't seen
You didn't
that.
think I was that fly?
I'm not going to answer that.
What you saying? What you saying now?
That's great. I love it. It's a Jessica I don't know.
No, actually, it is a Jessica you do know. It was taken in 32 Jane Street. I was getting dressed up to go, I don't remember where. I was over 30 because the necklace that I'm wearing was made by my mother and given to me on my 30th birthday. And I look at the image and try to remember if it was when I had an afro or not, because the turban is letting me not see my hair, so I don't remember exactly what the time period is. But yeah, I used to look like that. You just forgot. On a good day. On a good day, I can still look like that. With a lot of tape. Yeah, there you go.
There's questions, comments. Remember, this is the time when you ask your questions when she's afraid of answering, which is the best kind of question you can ask.
Oh, he's got it.
What was the hardest part of the book for you? Hardest, lynching or?
I think writing about Sam's death. Okay, Sam died from AIDS. I didn't know it. He was bisexual. It was a moment of coming to Jesus. It was painful. He also died very suddenly. I don't think people knew he was as ill as he was. He was such a pivot in that group that it was still a shock. It was still a shock. It was a shock to Maya. It had to have been a shock to Jimmy. It was a shock to David Baldwin. It was a shock to everybody. It was just like he was there, and then he wasn't.
What year was that?
I think it was 86, at the beginning of it, at the very beginning of it. And he died on April 1st, a cosmic April Fool's joke, because that's what it seemed like. And there is a part in the book that's all about St. Vincent's, which was the epicenter of that world. And there was nothing good about St. Vincent's back then. It was ground zero. It was horrific. I still hold my breath. It was unspeakable. And that happened in the space of a week. He was sick, he was gone. And that was the hardest thing I wrote.
I'm going to try not to embarrass you.
Yeah, like you'd ever do that.
I just love this book. And I'm biased because I'm your friend, but I just think it took such courage to unpack that story. And this is probably more of a statement than a question, but the thing I want to make sure.
I hate people who do that.
I know, but I'm doing it anyway because I have the mic. because I just want to encourage.
Now you know what kind of friends I got.
That's right. But I just want to encourage people that as they read this lovely memoir, there are just so many layers to it. And I just thought the Valentine to New York was just remarkable. And so do you have a favorite part of the book?
I'm actually not sure that I do. I mean, I like some of the part that talks about the West Side. I lived in the Village. I lived in the West Village. I lived first on Charles Street and then on Jane Street. But a lot of my friends, and this goes all the way back, because the book sort of begins with Club 81, then goes back to my parents and my upbringing, and then goes back to Sam's background. And then there's a chapter that's called, I think, Oh, the Places You'll Go, or the people, Oh, the People You'll Meet, certainly. But there's another one that's that talks about the West Side. And the West Side back then was the Wild, Wild West. I see Daryl's church is not saying amen. The West Side is not what it was, what it has become. It was very, very different. It also had a place called McKell's. Yeah. Okay, the church is definitely saying amen. Some of y'all looking a little embarrassed there. Okay, here we go. A critical mass of working black folk with disposable income changed the neighborhood's social life and resulted in the opening of several restaurants created by and for the new clientele. The Only Child restaurant on the downtown perimeter of the neighborhood at 226 West 79th offered not only food, but poetry readings by a growing roster of African American writers who were part of the thriving black arts movement. A listing in Black World/Negro Digest, remember that? Okay, for August of 1974 informs that previous artists to ascend the podium included writers Tom Weatherly Jr., Lynn Shorter, Mervyn Taylor, Judy Simmons, and Eloise Lofton. And those are names that mean stuff to folks who are here. The Cellar, 95th and Columbus. The church is starting to say amen. Run by the legendary black restaurateur Howard Johnson, was more in the center of the West Side zone. Under the Stairs on Columbus between 93rd and 94th. McKell's, located at the center of this pulsing Upper West Side zone, completed the list of nearby venues and was the third pole, if you will, in Baldwin's New York life. It offered jazz, good stiff drinks, along with some prime people watching, and had become the place on the music scene and the spot where the evening was guaranteed to end up, whether it began in one of the neighborhood places or even down in the Village. McKell's was a hub of black social activity on the West Side and all around town. On any given evening, folks from nearby Park West Village could be found propping up the bar, along with school principals and medical professionals. There was usually a goodly smattering of beautiful young women in a range of hues. Many were emerging fried, dried, and blown to the side from El Yunque, later El Yunque Oba, the city's preeminent black beauty salon helmed by Ruth Sanchez, who often was promoted by Essence magazine, required reading material for any black woman who wanted to be in the know. The women crossed McKell's threshold in search of a partner for life or a warm shoulder for the evening in times before booty calls, but after the opening gong of women's sexual liberation was sounded by the pill. El Yunque's proximity, complete with models, would-be models, wannabe models, and freshly done, well-groomed young single women it disgorged into the neighborhood, probably explained the number of single or not so single men who were regulars at the bar. Now, what we didn't know, what many people didn't know at the bar, was that the bartender was James Baldwin's brother, David. And so that completes the circle. But that was probably the most fun.
You gotta tell us about Whitney Houston.
No, Whitney was discovered at McKell's. I wasn't there that night, but she went to McKell's, and her mother, Sissy, was supposed to sing, and Sissy feigned something and didn't sing and pushed Whitney on, and voila. And then several times later, she, Erdogan was in the audience, and that was Sissy. That was Whitney, launched.
So, Jessica, you know I'm a fan.
Yes.
Given the
Makes you nervous to start that way.
Given the fact that this book goes in a completely unique direction from your other works, what made you decide to include recipes? And given the plethora of recipes available to you, how did you choose the ones that are in this book?
Okay, well, it was actually a question. It was a question. I sat down, my editor sort of said, well, recipes, no recipes. And we batted it around, recipes, no recipes, recipes. And we finally said, you know what? You're known for cookbooks. Put some recipes in there. Get on with it. And so we did. And the trick was each chapter ends with a recipe that is in some way related to the chapter. So the first chapter begins with any of you who had any experience of the West Village back in the 70s and 80s would know a restaurant called El Faro's. And the church is saying amen again. Okay, El Faro's was literally, El Faro means the lighthouse in Spanish, and it was like the beacon for anybody who lived in the West Village. And one of the things that I always loved in El Faro's was the caldo gallego. And so that's the recipe for that chapter. There is a story that I sort of tell on myself about serving my version of choucroute, sauerkraut, to a man that I later discovered was a 2-star Michelin chef. You have no idea how funny it is until you realize that my version consisted of a can of sauerkraut, 5 francs, a can of beer, and a slug of gin, and maybe some potatoes. And he ate it. And I think came back for seconds, and Georges Garin was just generous. Absolutely, unbelievably generous. So there is a recipe for, shall we say, a slightly more appropriate choucroute. There is, a recipe for goujonette de sole, my way. Goujonette de sole, there used to be across the street. Sam, we loved Michael's, excuse me, but we also loved the opera. And Sam was quite the operavore, knew any number of people, and one of the great glories for me about having written the book is it's allowed me to reconnect with Martina Arroyo, who is a diva assoluta, if you know opera, and who I've known for 40 years, thanks to Sam. But there used to be a restaurant across the street from Lincoln Center called Le Poulailler, and it became like the Sardi's for the opera. And so we would go to the opera and then waddle ourselves across the street, plonk down on the banquettes at Le Poulailler, and I would always invariably order the goujonette de sole. So each of the recipes is in some way linked to the chapter, including the chapter where Sam dies, where the recipe is simply entitled, I Can't Cook Now, I'll Just Drink. Okay, yes.
Time for a couple more questions.
You mentioned the significance of listening to your mentors and other generations. I wonder what advice could you give to educators today about teaching millennials to do the same?
I think there's a lot of stuff there, because, don't forget, I teach at a college. I'm teaching millennials, and I've been teaching every generation. I stopped teaching French when they started to say they had been born in 1960, because that just was too awful. And God knows when they're born now, because I don't have to ask, quelle année êtes-vous né, so that it's a little easier to deal with how young they really are. I think there are two things. I think one is be interesting. Be interesting and be interested. I think if they sense that you have an interest in what they do, or, every once in a while I'll lob a reference over that they'll look at me and go like, you know that? It's like, yeah. So, I've taken to doing all sorts of things. I have a very bad airport habit. I buy In Touch, and I buy Life and Style, and I read them before the plane takes off, and I give them to the flight attendant as they're going down for the first trash collection. But it allows me to say something really tacky about Kim Kardashian or Kanye or somebody, and they look at me and go, dang, she got gray hair, but maybe she's not that bad, or she, find a way to connect. And I think that if you can connect, they connect back. And I think that's the best way, because lecturing doesn't always work. We know, because we didn't listen either.
I was just wondering.
You've already interviewed
I
me.
know, and I didn't get to ask one question, which is just about logistics, because you have all of these amazing memories, and I'm wondering if you've how you access them. Do you keep journals, or do you keep menus from these restaurants, or how do you get into the? Where do you write? How does it all happen? That's a few questions in one.
Well, here's two things. I keep journals now. I didn't keep journals then. I unfortunately have a house, the word that comes most immediately to mind is collier, spelled Collyer, as in those guys that had the mansion when the piles of crap fell over and killed one of them, the other one died because he couldn't find the one that got killed by the crap. That's sort of my decorating style, So, in the course of writing this, I found my date book for 1974. And the strange thing about that is it had a list. And I don't know if I reproduced it in the book, but it had a list of all the operas I'd gone to. And I looked at that and it was just astounding, because it was like, dang, I heard all the voices of the second half of the 20th century. But that's the only thing I found. I ordered a menu from Chez Garin online, facsimile, just because I wanted to be sure what it was. But I have for many years been able to repeat that meal that I had there. It was about what the little vegetables might have been. But that ragout de truffe, that truffle stew, which was basically, I think I call it a revolution, whatever, I don't remember, but I have a lovely locution that I will never be able to reproduce. But the idea is it's a stew. A stew is sort of a nice peasant dish, but it's a stew made of truffles. So instead of meat, they're just whole, thick pieces of truffle. And it's called a ragout de truffe, and I've never had one since. I had one that night at Chez Garin. The two-star chef I served the choucroute to. Think those Frankfurters, think ragout de truffe, and you begin to get the level of embarrassment. And that was the course that started the meal before we went on to a baron of lamb. And then it went beyond that. So it's just like, choucroute, never again. So yeah, so the process is very helter-skelter. But mostly it is that I have somehow or other inherited my father's memory. And my father had the most extraordinary recall. He had the ability to bring it back when he needed it, if he'd ever seen it. To the point where I remember at one party in my house, a friend of mine had actually been to some swank event somewhere. And my father had read about it in W. My father was one of those people who, when W came out, that was one of his Christmas gifts every year. You had to have a subscription because he had to keep up. He told her more about the party than she knew. And she had actually been there. He had not. So I have that kind of visual thing from my dad. So it all comes together in that.